Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to begin in just a minute here, but we want to make sure folks joining just a little bit late have a chance to join in. So sit back and get ready for a great training presentation today. For anyone just joining us, I just mentioned we're going to let folks who are just a little late slowly start to join the training session. So if you just give us another minute, we'll be getting started here. All right, we're going to begin. Hello, everyone. I'm Mallory Batches. I'm the Director of Strategic Development at the Congress for the New Urbanism. And I want to welcome you to the training for the guidance manual, Enabling Better Places, a zoning guide for Vermont neighborhoods. This training today is being brought to you with funding from AARP Vermont in partnership with the Congress for the New Urbanism and support from the Department of Housing and Community Development in Vermont. This guide and training are part of CNU's Project for Code Reform, a strategic initiative to support cities and towns as they reform outdated zoning bylaws in favor of more walkable communities. The how-to manual promotes practical small steps that Vermont cities, towns, and villages can take to address widespread regulatory barriers that limit the choice of homes available to Vermont residents at prices people can afford. Today's training is meant to complement the pre-recorded introductory lessons that you hopefully have already viewed to help ground you in the fundamentals of the incremental bylaw reform methodology underlying the guide, Enabling Better Places, Zoning for Vermont Neighborhoods. Today, I'll be providing this live introductory Q&A session with my fellow PCR faculty member, Susan Henderson, Principal at Placemakers and Board Chair-elect of the CNU Board of Directors. A little bit about my background. I lead the Project for Code Reform, our CNU's programmatic work in that. And I'm an urban designer by training and have worked throughout the country on writing and reforming zoning codes and land use regulations. And I'm joined today by Susan Henderson, who brings an extraordinary wealth of experience in code writing. She also serves as a board member on the Transect Codes Council and the Form-Based Codes Institute, in addition to her participation on the CNU board. Now, before we begin, Legislative Representative Thomas Stevens has a few words that he would like to share with our group today.
Thank you, Mallory. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Stevens, and I live in downtown Waterbury, Vermont, formerly the village of Waterbury, and now the Edward for our utility district. And I chair the House Committee on General Housing and Military Affairs in the Vermont legislature. I'd like to thank you for inviting me and for the privilege of kicking off this training for the great neighborhoods. From where I sit, this is an important training, and I appreciate all of you for making the time to attend. But first, I want to quickly thank the hardworking folks at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, AARP Vermont, the Department of Housing and Community Development, Vermont Realtors, the RPCs, and CNU for all their work producing Enabling Better Places zoning for Vermont neighborhoods. It's a terrific resource for communities and for legislators as we consider legislation with respect to zoning in our committee in the House. I'm also incredibly thankful for the dedication of everyone here today. The fact that you're attending this training tells me that you understand that housing is the foundation for a safe and healthy life, this year more than ever. When faced with this pandemic, it's clear that if we are to persevere with the need to stay safe at home, we need housing we can be safe in. And when the pandemic ceases to be the driving force behind our policy making, the basic facts remain the same. The zoning matters. And the other realities remain too. So whether your interests are in climate change, housing affordability, or social justice, or community revitalization, zoning still matters. While zoning reform is not going to create housing by itself, taken together with new funding for affordable homes, increased support for local and regional planning, reform of Act 250, we can create places for older adults to downsize and stay in the neighborhoods they've lived in for years. And we can build more affordable first homes for Vermonters, and we can create more opportunities for Vermonters to live close to work, school, or stores. They can spend less time in their cars and have more time and money to spend on friends, family, and community. What I appreciate more than anything else about the work that you're about to do is that you have an opportunity to contemplate the big what is, rules and regulations that may be 70 years old and originally written in a very different time and place with a very different desired outcome, and have an opportunity to contemplate the big what if. What if we are able to reshape these rules and regulations and laws into where we can work together to create more inclusive and welcoming communities and open the door to new neighbors. The work you're doing today and on Thursday is important, and it's critical to build a stronger and better Vermont. I think we can all agree on that. Incredible things are possible when people come together to improve the places that matter to them. I'd like to stay longer and participate more, but I have to leave this meeting to hear the governor's budget address, which should be very good for housing this year, we hope. Enjoy this time today and tomorrow to work with Mallory, or on Thursday. It'll be good work and will benefit your communities, which can only benefit the state as a whole. So thanks for having me come in to do these opening remarks, and back to you, Mallory.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and a great kickoff to our discussion today. And I want to do a little bit of explanation and housekeeping as how we're going to do this. There are over 100 participants in this session, and so that means that we're going to try and keep folks muted and ask you to ask your questions through the chat feature. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat button. We are asking you to, if you haven't used that before, you can go ahead and click on it. It will open up a panel on the side of your screen, and you can type in there any questions that you have. And we would love to have questions either about the pre-recorded introductory lessons that you all would have watched already, or questions about the document itself. Things that you have found in reading it that you would like clarified, or things that you think the group might benefit from hearing some thoughts about. And we'll ask you, like I said, to stay muted. If there's clarification that you need to do on a question, we understand. But by and large, Susan and I are going to go through and find different questions to respond to. If we don't get to yours right away, don't think that we have missed it. We'll try to get back to earlier questions. We'll sort of try and be taking these as they sort of feed off each other, if that makes sense. And feel free to continue to add questions to the list. We're going to continue to look through that chat function ourselves throughout the course of the session. If questions are raised that are better suited for a group discussion, sort of dialogue, like the type that's going to be taking place on Thursday with the deep dive discussion session, we're going to acknowledge those questions and point out that we'd like you to bring those back on Thursday, that those are the sort of things those are the sort of topics that do better through a dialogue rather than this sort of big, broad Q&A session. And so with that, I hope you'll start adding your questions to the chat, and Susan Henderson and I are going to go ahead and get started. And Susan, I have a question to kick us off, sort of something that you and I can both probably reflect on, and that is the particular rural character of Vermont. And when we did the research work that led to this document, the many communities in Vermont are facing unique, either constricted development space sort of conditions, because it's a village that's very small, or it may be have geographic restraints that they are dealing with, and that leads to some particular challenges when we're talking about housing and really how much impact you can have even if you go through addressing some bylaw reform. And I think that I hope that we were able to infuse some of that understanding into the document. But I bring that up to say that was something that did, the team that worked on these recommendations spent a good deal of time focusing on and really trying to calibrate what we know from other parts of the country into the document itself. And Susan, I don't know if you want to elaborate before we do. If you haven't noticed, folks, on your screen, there is a poll to try and get an idea of exactly where folks are coming from here today. So please feel free to fill that out. And Susan, I don't know if you wanted to comment any about that unique rural character in Vermont yourself.
Well, thanks, Mallory. And it's very true that you are blessed with a phenomenal landscape, and with the fact that you have managed through the centuries to preserve it. And a large part of that is your topography and your waterways have a tendency to incentivize preservation. But let's face it, you all have been incredible stewards of your landscape. And as such, one of the things as you begin to think about, and someone just put a question in the chat to define rural character and character of the area. So in response to that, as well as thinking about how you provide for greater housing opportunity within your state, so much of it as to whether the communities will be resistant and fearful, or whether they will welcome it, largely has to do with the character and how delicately you can fit it in. And a lot of the term we like to use is gentle density. So density that reflects the form of the neighborhood or of the village or of the town, and different places within the village or the town or the city are different in character, some more intense, some less intense. And so understanding as you do your bylaw reform that the success of it is entirely connected to how sensitive you are to reflecting the place it's going to go. And sorry to wax eloquent on this, but Peter Duval, you brought up something that's incredibly interesting to me. And that is the fact that we've all suffered from the 1950s Xerox zoning that has been applied all across North America, where because local governments can utilize regulations from other local governments without fear of copyright, etc. You in some of your towns and villages actually may have zoning that's appropriate in Muncie, Indiana, not in Waterbury, Vermont. And so to look at, one thing we saw was there was this hugely uniform 20-foot front setback. And I'm sorry, folks, that is suburbia at its best. And in very few contexts does it reflect your historic character. So a lot of what you do as you begin to reform your bylaws and thinking about increasing housing opportunities is you look at the places in your jurisdiction that people love the most. And you measure how far are these buildings set back from the street. Are these historically duplexes or triplexes, or, have these mansions been subdivided? We saw one in Montpelier that was originally a huge mansion of a house that when I was counting doorbells, I found 16 units. And so, but it fit in beautifully because of the character of the area in which it was situated. So all that is to say, observation is going to be your biggest asset. If you utilize your eyes and just count doorbells and measure setbacks and building heights and model your reform instead of on Muncie, Indiana, model it on the place you're working. People will usually respond favorably to the reforms that you're proposing. Sorry, that was very long-winded, Mallory.
That was it, but that was a good. I think, you know, one of the things that you point out with that challenge of many of these bylaws having been, you know, photocopied or mimeographed or whatever the technology was at the time from somewhere like Muncie, Indiana, is specifically to that aspect of the fact that the population of communities in Vermont is substantially smaller. Even in, you know, larger towns, Montpelier, Brattleboro, we're still talking about populations that are much smaller than Muncie, Indiana. And so the sort of waste or largesse that a zoning code from one of those locations, the sort of sprawl nature of a zoning code from one of those locations has the I don't want to call it a luxury, but can endure, isn't possible in Vermont communities, in part, you know, because of these sort of, whether it's, you know, mountains or a river or just growth boundaries that are going to restrict development. Or, as Chris Robbins points out here, that the difficulty of increasing density in some towns and villages is because there's no sewer system in the first place. And so some of the things that might be possible in a larger community with more robust infrastructure is simply not going to be available, is not going to be an option without an extraordinary investment in infrastructure upgrades that communities, you know, very much may not be able to tackle.
That's a really good point. And, you know, you can increase a sense of place in communities that are dependent on septic, because you're able to cluster and still maintain the area that's necessary per family. However, it doesn't help with the density issue at all. And you know, that's going to rely on some sort of an infrastructure change, which is costly.
I do think
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it leads me to, you know, you talked about gentle density, and we knew in Vermont going in and certainly experienced this during the research work, that ADUs are really one of those, you know, sort of entry points of infusing small amounts of density, but simply increasing the number of households, but doing so in a way that does have, it's a much lighter touch on whatever the infrastructure restrictions might be, and also one that's fairly popular in Vermont already. There's a great deal of attention towards that, and something that typically, you know, in my past home, I had an ADU. It helps with the affordability of housing, either as a product itself and or to help reduce the cost of the homeowner. You know, they're able to rent out a portion of their property and you know, offset some of the cost of their home ownership. But ADUs were something that, you know, we explored in quite extensively during our work for this project.
So Mallory, I'd like to go back to the first comment, which was, are there particular issues that the form-based code could help with? Because the project for code reform, the mandate of it is that you right-size your reform to the capacity of the location. And form-based codes are the gold standard. They're like, if you really want to get the maximum density with the greatest community buy-in, a form-based code is a perfect way to do it, because it controls so much of the outcome that it enables residents to be more comfortable with the suggested densities. But there is a huge issue that we discovered when we were working with you all last year, and that was capacity of local staff. And many of the villages that we met with, actually, the planning commissions or the planning boards were the people that were reviewing plans, and RPCs were critical in providing staffing. And so because you don't really have the capacity internally in the smaller communities to, administration of a form-based code is a learning curve. And, you know, it's delightful. It's like, sorry, I'm a Mac. I live in Mac world, not PC world. And so this is my favorite analogy, is that the transition from PC to Mac, there's a learning curve. You know, you change an operating system and it takes a while, but once you do it, you never go back. So, you know, you realize it was worth the learning curve. But just know that if you're considering a form-based code, you know, we write them all the time. It's a critical part of our company's business model. But if you don't have professional staff and you have a very limited development community, that's probably not the best fit for your jurisdiction. That's my gut reaction.
Well, and I do think, Susan, I'd add to that in some of the responses that we got in the survey when y'all registered. Some folks responded talking about how they had in their community, they had implemented a form-based code for a small area of the community, maybe like a corridor or some particular area of growth or something like that. And I think an important, what I want to underscore of what Susan was saying is an important aspect of what incremental code reform recommendations are their testing ground that can lead you to the sort of broader scale reform that you might find in a full wholesale form-based code. But even if you were, you know, wanting to test certain aspects of bylaw reform that might lead you to wanting to have a form-based code for a particular growth area of your community, that this isn't a baby step towards these larger goals or these larger reform tasks that Susan was describing. Let's see, I'll go back through these questions. I see a couple comments about short-term housing. This is a unique, so this is a unique challenge that we recognize. There are communities that don't face this at all in Vermont. And then there are communities that this is maybe the most pressing impact, particularly in some of the, you know, ski villages across Vermont, that this may be one of the strongest impacts on affordability. And I think that this is a challenge of, you know, in part, I'll start by saying understanding your market, that your market is not just the visitors who are coming to your community, but also the residents of the community, the service industry of the community, that, you know, having that broader understanding of the community itself, that can lead into, you know, issues of what staff capacity is and what NIMBYism might be at work in your community and what the development community wants to invest in. But I say all that to say this is a very complex topic and something that, you know, we talked about a fair bit. We had Ludlow was one of the case study communities that we studied in order to craft the guide that you all have referenced. And so it wasn't something that we bypassed, but it is unique for only certain communities across Vermont.
So I may segue, because that was such a good answer. And the reality is it is so very specific to where you are that there's not a uniform answer that applies. And somewhat the next comment was speaking to the benefits of development of a physical plan. particularly to inform infrastructure planning. And that, I think that's a critical issue that is often, because of the financial expenditures usually associated with it, particularly if it's a visioning plan, it involves a lot of community engagement, and in the time of the pandemic, that's difficult to achieve. It's one of those things that a local government really has to plan toward. But without that, and without the community participation in that, then your capital improvement budget and plan is almost impossible to properly craft. And not only that, then when you're doing your bylaw reform, if you can point back to this is enabling the plan, then normally it gets a lot more community support. So that's one of the the cornerstones of the Project for Code Reform is know where you are. And part of the know where you are and providing the appropriate reform for that location is having a plan to look to.
Mhm, mhm. I did see a question about parking minimums. There's a question here that says, our planning commission had a discussion last night about eliminating parking minimums outside our downtown. Very strong feelings by some that could lead to rentals where tenants had to park very far away or too much on-street parking. And asking if we've heard this before and what some possible responses would be. And Susan, I don't know if you want to jump in, but my first take is that if the Planning Commission is already talking about eliminating parking minimums, you have some pretty good capacity, some political capacity, just in the willingness to have the discussion, compared to many communities. So that's at least a good first step right there.
That is, and what, the rental issue is a concern. I would say for the most part, if an applicant or a developer is going to maintain ownership of the property, you can rest assured they're going to provide parking that's necessary for their market. So in other words, if locally, I mean, let's face it, y'all don't live in Florida. So, with your winters in particular, if it were me, I would want, I mean, you can tell from my gray hair, I want to know where my car is going to land for the night before I head home. And I think the wise applicant who's going to maintain ownership will provide the parking that the market demands. So, but in many places that may be naive because predatory developers do exist. And people that intend to flip the property don't have that long-term vested interest economically. So there's a lot of things, once again, this is sort of a local issue that you have to be responsive to. I would say in a downtown, it's a no-brainer because there's enough naturally occurring like on-street parking that, and your historic development patterns are so compact already that requiring on-site parking in many locations really just is foolish. But as you get further and further from the town center, parking it's just a part of that ecosystem that you have to plan for. However, all of that being said, it's kind of like the Xerox bylaws from the 50s. Parking minimums was established in much the same way. It was a random number selected and copied by a planner, by planners in that same era, the 40s and 50s, that had nothing to do with parking studies or data gathering or any sort of parking impacts. So those numbers, I mean, you could throw a dart at the wall and chances are you hit a number and it's as valid as the numbers that are in your code today. So just to understand that the 2 spaces per unit or per bedroom or whatever, in whatever numbers you're using, are likely dramatically overparked. And if you watch the recorded sessions, you know, something that we're all becoming very sensitive to is systemic racism. And the parking regulations, just like the density regulations, were really established to control demographics and within communities, and to eliminate, you know, people that were less affluent and had less resources. And just realize that's the motivation behind most of your parking standards.
There's a couple other questions that are I'm gonna piggyback onto this discussion that are interrelated. One, Marcy Carver asked about how to deal with parking when the streets are too narrow for on-street parking. And Bob Robbins added what to do when the main street is a state highway. Both of which are sort of calling out that there are times where on-street parking either doesn't exist in plentiful supply, and or can't, or the challenge against the state DOT may lead you to be unable to add some, even if the roadway were wide enough to be able to do so physically. And I brought those two to the forefront because one of the things that you'll notice in the guidance document, although the focus is on housing and access and affordability of housing, as was the charge of our work, we talk about streetscape improvements. We talk about improving walkability more generally, and about improving the walkability of adjacent neighborhoods to downtowns and main streets, specifically because parking, as Susan said, that ecosystem, parking is a part of that ecosystem, but the ecosystem doesn't exist within a snapshot. The more walkable that the community is broadly, the more bikeable, the more multimodal, even a small village can be, the more that these precise concerns can be at least somewhat mitigated. And so someone that lives 3 or 4 blocks from town doesn't have to drive into town, or maybe 10 blocks from town, but doesn't have to drive into town because there is a safe route from where they live into downtown, or if they work or whatever. Now, back to that issue of Vermont being very rural and folks driving from one village to another, there, to Susan's point, the ecosystem is still important. Being able to park your vehicle is still an important task. And yet, part of why the guide has more breadth than just simply housing affordability is because all of these intricate pieces work together. If someone can afford to not own 1 car per adult in a household, they can reduce their expenditure, which ultimately reduces, they might be able to afford more in housing because they can spend less in transportation costs, for example. I don't know, Susan, if you wanted to expand on that, but that was just sort of a point as I saw those 2 questions interrelated that I wanted to make.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. And parking, negotiating with your state DOT, you know, you're not alone. That's everywhere we work. That's an issue. And on-street parking on state routes is very, very difficult to achieve. It, you know, sometimes you can negotiate it, but you have to start, you know, in the beginning of their design cycle long before it gets to funding cycles. So, you know, that can be a 10-year project to get that to happen.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting question here, Susan, and I know you worked on this a little bit just in trying to, you know, proof of concept while we were doing while we were writing the recommendations. But there's a question about some ways to encourage cottage cluster housing development, and particularly because that can speak to a lot of different markets that are in need of housing in Vermont. And also because in some ways it opens up opportunity, potentially opens up opportunity for a septic system. It's a better mechanism for smaller housing provision, but with a septic system. And I know you did some sketches about that while we were doing this work.
Yeah, I like the a term encouraged, because usually, I mean, a synonym for that is incentivize. And so if you're not getting it and you want to get it, you know, you have to figure out what are the barriers to it. And usually it's that somehow it's not working within your existing bylaw system. So is it because of lot size requirements? You know, one solution for it when you have when you have large lot sizes required is to help the builder understand how to make it a condominium project. So it's a single parcel with multiple units. You have to look carefully at your bylaws and see really what are the barriers to doing it. Is it number of units per lot? Is it lot size? Is it parking location or parking minimums? And so there are many things that could be standing in the way of your success. I would start by polling specific developers that may have indicated an interest, seeing why they didn't do it, and then looking carefully at your districts that it could be out, that you would consider it in, and making sure that they'll permit it.
There's a question from Seth Jensen asking about if we'll be doing similar trainings around Act 250. And the short answer is not right now, but I do think that there's opportunity for on Thursday for some discussions around those areas where state regulations are impeding what you might locally be wanting to do, or might locally be empowering through bylaw reform. You might still be facing some state regulatory obstacles. And I think that's probably a good group discussion sort of topic to fold in, because what we found in working with the case study communities is sometimes one community had figured out how to work with that challenge, or had some particular strategies that they had resolved that that another community might not know about yet. And so that's a little bit of what we're trying to accomplish with Thursday's sessions, is to get some of that collaborative dialogue going. But specifically to Seth's question, we don't right now have trainings around particular to state regs that we're going to focus on, unfortunately.
So I just realized we didn't answer. Diane had an issue that is kind of near to my heart. My business partner lives in Winnipeg, which their snowfall is shocking. Anyway, and they have a similar issue. So Diane said, can you speak to on-street parking, to an on-street parking ban from December to April for snow removal? And we've worked in a lot of winter cities across the globe, and usually at a minimum, I mean, the ideal scenario is it's only a ban during a snow emergency. That it's declared and it's announced on the radio and television, and people are aware when they're going to have to move their vehicle. The next best option is that it's even odd side of the road, so that you at least have half the capacity at all times. And but rarely have I heard of a complete ban from December to April. That seems, I can't imagine economically that could work for your city or your village, town. That, if you read Donald Shoup's High Cost of Free Parking, it's been around a long time now, but the actual economic impact of on-street parking for a local government, that your jurisdictions need to understand it's a utility. Just like is what Mr. Shoup says, just like, gas and electric and water, it is an actual utility for your jurisdiction that has huge economic impacts, particularly for your business sector. And so, you guys probably need to be taking a look at what you're doing to your economy if you have a complete ban for 5 months. That's a long time.
Mhm. Well, and it ties to another question, Susan. There was a question Jane Douglas asked, how can you eliminate parking space requirements when your town has no public transportation and no jobs in town so that every adult has to have a car? But I think, that's different, but a related sort of issue. If the village is simply housing, then there isn't a particular purpose for eliminating parking. We're getting back to that issue of the ecosystem and the health of the ecosystem and the interrelationship between shops and jobs and housing and daily needs and how any one person accesses those, and if there is the capacity based on the development pattern, based on the infrastructure in place for people to use a transportation option other than cars. In some cases, you may be so rural or so not mixed of use that is not one of your challenges. And that's great. You can toss that out. That's not one of the things that you're going to address in order to improve your housing affordability. It's going to be other things. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I had looked at Alex.
That was the next one I had up too.
Yeah, this is a really good, it's a really good point, critique, and I think it's worth a conversation because there are huge differences of opinion associated with it. That the guide recommends removing density caps. Well, yes and no, it's not exactly, and we'll get to that. And unnecessary architectural treatment requirements to make communities willing to accept the higher density. They may need the architectural design standards, especially to guide construction of new buildings. And this is, and to avoid the plain vanilla construction. So these are all really good points, and it gets back to the benefits of a form-based code, because even though it's our form-based bylaw, even though that's all within your bylaw structure, it's clear and objective standards that result in a much better building as a result. It's not about beauty and it's not about style, but you can control things like durable materials, and you can list what those are, and you can control things like the amount of clear glazing so you don't get blank walls. And you can control a lot within your bylaw that there is a strong case for health, safety, and welfare. Like, for example, size of windows is directly tied to daylighting and cross ventilation. So it's an environmental issue rather than just an aesthetic issue. But our big concern is really twofold. Well, let's start with the density thing. We're not saying to remove density caps altogether. We're just saying control it by something that is predictable. So the guide recommends using bulk standards. So that's building heights and setbacks and lot coverage. And those things very clearly will result in a specific density, even though it's not using the word DUA or whatever your local acronym is. It is, if I say you can do a 2.5-story building, so 2 stories with inhabited attic, and you have a 12-foot front setback, 5-foot side setbacks, and your lot size is X and your lot coverage is Y, I pretty easily can tell you your density is going to be from, A to B. And so you're definitely controlling density, but it's in a way that people can visualize it. The biggest problem with density is a metric. If you say 4 units per acre, most people have no idea what that really looks like. And if you say 12 units per acre, they don't know what that looks like either, but they know it terrifies them, even though it may be very appropriate based on the way you all have subdivided some of your historic structures. So we're still controlling density, but it's in a different manner. And then the issue of architecture, and this is my own pet peeve, and it's because I'm an architect and I've looked at lots and lots of codes, in particular form-based codes that have all of these architectural regulations that are about building articulation and changing materials and all this stuff. And I say it results in a zebra building. You know, it's all this stripedy stuff and it's hyperactive and it has nothing to do with good architecture. It's only because the planner was afraid they were going to get the plain vanilla building. And so the problem is zoning bylaws cannot control beauty. And you're right, if you really do want beauty, architectural design guidelines that are clear and objective, you know, that actually have standards embedded. And you can do this in your historic communities legally. That's the way to approach the architecture, because I have to tell you, unless they have a degree in architecture and unless they're practiced in historic architectural details associated with the styles that exist in and the eras that exist in the Vermont built environment, your average planner is going to design for you a bylaw that stinks. You know, it's just, it is what it is. There are too many unintended consequences associated with trying to zone for architecture.
Mhm.
That's my opinion.
But I think at least shared by me. And, you know, this is going to dovetail just a little bit, but there are a couple of questions in here that bring up the challenge of the fire regulations. And one of the questions was, you know, that building height is often dictated by firefighting capability, which I recall talking about when we were, you know, initially doing the workshop. And also another that talks about cottage court development in South Burlington, where a major challenge was making a, quote, driveway work so that the fire truck could get in and out efficiently. And then, you know, unit prices were not in the affordable range, and one has to ask, you know, how much that accommodation, at least on some level, added to the lack of affordability of those units. And you know, we certainly talked a fair bit about the you know, health and safety requirements and the way what you can and what you can't actually reform, and ways to work around that while we were doing this study. But I think it, you know, this relates to that issue of trying to replicate things that have been successful in the past with what you want new development to achieve, and running into walls, particularly in health and safety requirements, and fire marshals in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is very true that building height is controlled usually by whether or not you have a ladder truck. And also, you know, in some of your towns and villages, anything over 2 or 3 stories wouldn't be appropriate anyway. But and that, you know, the alternative to that destroys affordability, or at least mitigates it, or compromises it, and that is sprinkling. And you have to do that over a certain height also for multifamily. So, you know, the whole fire code, the International Fire Code, begins to, you know, the intent is to protect safety and welfare, but it also has deep impacts on affordability.
Mm-hmm. There was a comment that I wanted to pull forward. Seth brought up a tool in addressing parking in rural areas where on-street isn't available, of stacking parking for multifamily or residential. And certainly we saw evidence of that in Montpelier and in Burlington, when you have some of these historic properties that have been converted into multifamily, that, you know, they don't have ample space to meet wide numbers of parking spaces on their property. And that was one way that, you know, we saw folks getting around that. And I think it's a great, you know, suggestion to try to incorporate.
Yeah, tandem parking is a great solution. And if people are willing to, you know, live with the constraints and negotiate who gets to get out and when, it's a really good, it's an effective use of driveway space. And it, you know, for per car, it's a reduction in impervious surface because you can utilize a driveway.
There is a question here, or there's a comment here about communities with designated downtowns and being required by state statute to have either design review or historic district review. And the comment is useful. I wanted to draw folks' attention about you know, that being the case, but it leads me to a question I wanted to bring up, Susan. One of the things that we discussed with some detail was the review process itself, the challenges that many communities perhaps even inadvertently place on the development of housing because of an onerous process for getting for permitting and the conditional review, you know, the manner in which perhaps a fear of allowing something too aggressively leads to an extended development process that only adds to the cost of the housing that's being developed in the first place.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you can have, I mean, I really did enjoy Steve's comment about the designated downtowns because like I mentioned, I think your best tool for maintaining your historic character is to have historic district guidelines. I mean, those are really the best tool for that. And within that scenario, that the other big thing, because we've done a lot of that work over time, is, you know, what do you do with the National Park Service requirements that say that you match rhythm and mass and materials, but you don't match style or detail. You know, you try to make it of its time. I think there's a big debate over that too, and I don't know how Vermonters feel about it, but I do think that the historic district guidelines is your best tool for many of your communities because you have such an incredibly rich history, and that is something that you really want to protect.
And Jen Murray just posted, you know, getting back to that idea of clear and objective architectural guidelines being the way to go, and how to use those in the review of applications. And I think, you know, one of the challenges that we noted, and you know, I think that has come up a number of times, is that many folks that are administering these processes are doing so on a voluntary basis across the state of Vermont. That we're not necessarily talking about large municipal staff that their entire role is to tick boxes through checklists to make sure that you know, to make sure compliance of projects coming through occurs. And I think that the simplification of your process and the simplification of the requirements, if I could sort of really boil down what Susan had suggested, is where the key lies. Just understanding the capacity of individual commissions to be able to get a desired outcome from the process.
Yeah, we've worked a lot the last couple of years in Washington and Oregon, and their state law, their growth management acts, which control land use, both have a mandate for, they refer to it as clear and objective standards. And it determines where you fit in the public process. You can have a staff, an administrative review of an application, which is, you know, it can be at the counter that you can get an approval if you're responding directly to a clear and objective standard. And so that has incentivized most local governments to do bylaw rewrites, just to make sure that they provide that benefit. Because once you speed up the process, you're increasing affordability. Your applicant should be able to deliver the project faster and more affordable if they don't have the time cost of time value of money of carrying a loan. So all of that being said, you know, your abundant use of conditional use permits and approvals really is contradictory to your desire for increased affordability. Completely understand the goal of protecting character. And, you know, if you do have, whether it's historic district or architectural guidelines, either one, the best practice with those is also that the standards are clear and objective, because if they aren't, your built result is only as good as the people that sit on your review boards. And those may be architects, and they may be architects with historical experience, or they may be, I mean, they may be the kid right out of architecture school, and you're probably still pretty lucky if you get that. Or, you know, they may be my Aunt Sally, who had anything to do with design, because you're relying on your volunteer base. So because the quality of your standards is really all your committees have to work with, you know, those also need to be, you have to avoid subjectivity.
That's a great point, Susan. And I think I'm looking at time, and we're coming here on the end of our hour. There were some additional questions in here in the chat that I think I would encourage you to bring to Thursday's session. These were some really great questions. And there's, in each of these questions that we answered today, both Susan and I could probably go on quite a while longer on each. And so if you felt like you didn't get the depth that you were hoping for, or we sort of missed your follow-up reply, I'd very much encourage you to bring those questions back to Thursday's session. And I want to thank everyone for all that you added here today. Thursday's training session is going to be a deep dive participatory discussion. It's going to build on today's training, and it'll focus on facilitating a generative dialogue with all of the participants involved on how to take action on incremental bylaw reform in your community. I think it's going to be really enjoyable. I hope that you bring your excitement to talk about the opportunities and the challenges that you have in your own community. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to be joined again by Susan and also by Hazel Boris, who is going to help facilitate also a wealth of knowledge with Hazel on these issues, on these coding issues. So she's going to be a great addition to our team. We have added, I'm going to add a link here in just a moment into the chat box that will take you to a survey that we hope that you will take. This is going to help us plan for that session on Thursday and give us some idea on what your experience with bylaw reform is, how much you've worked with bylaws in the past in your own community or you know, in your own professional capacity. And there we go. There's the link for everyone to that survey. I'm also going to share with you a worksheet that will help you plan for this session. And both of these items will be shared with you by email as well at the close of this session. So if you missed the link here in the chat box, don't worry. We're gonna send those to you by email as well. And let me pull that file here quickly, and then you should have everything that you need. Let's see, it's not loading up. Well, That's a frustration. Sorry, folks, it seems like it doesn't really want to copy for me, but like I said, you will be getting this in an email as well. And so, so here we go. It seems to be working now. So let's see if it'll load up. and like I said, you'll be getting these in an email as well. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining today. A recording of this session is going to be available on the YouTube channel that you watched all of the introductory videos with. So we will let you know when that's available. And we look forward to speaking with you all again on Thursday. Thank you so much, everyone.